It was a calm and sunny Wednesday afternoon in Maplewood, the kind of day where everything seemed peaceful. The streets were lined with neatly trimmed hedges, and the air carried the faint smell of freshly cut grass. John Harper, a man in his mid-40s with warm brown eyes and salt and pepper hair, pulled his silver SUV to a stop outside Maplewood Elementary School. He checked his watch. It was 3:25 p.m., just enough time for him to grab his daughter Emily from soccer practice before heading home. John loved these little moments of routine. They were simple but meaningful, like the way Emily's face lit up when she saw him waiting by the curb, or how she always launched into stories about her day as soon as she climbed into the car. Today, though, something unusual caught his attention even before Emily appeared. Across the street, an elderly woman named Mrs. Patterson stood on her porch, struggling to control her golden retriever mix. The dog, a scruffy ball of energy with bright, intelligent eyes, was tugging hard at its leash, barking loudly in John's direction. At first, John thought nothing of it. Dogs bark all the time. Maybe this one was excited to see someone new. But as he rolled down his window to wave politely, he noticed something strange. The dog wasn't just barking randomly. It was staring straight at him, its body tense and alert. Its sharp barks echoed through the quiet neighborhood, drawing curious glances from other parents picking up their kids. Mrs. Patterson looked flustered, apologizing profusely as she tried to pull the dog back inside. "I'm so sorry," she called out. "He's usually such a good boy." John smiled weakly, trying to brush off the awkwardness. "No problem," he replied, though he couldn't help feeling unsettled. There was something about the intensity of the dog's gaze that made him uneasy. It wasn't playful or friendly. It felt almost accusing. Shaking his head slightly, he told himself not to overthink it. After all, what could a dog possibly know? But the longer the dog kept barking, the more uncomfortable John became. Other parents began to take notice too. One mom walked past, giving him a puzzled look as if wondering why the dog had singled him out. A dad leaning against his truck smirked and joked, "What did you do to upset Fido?" John forced a laugh, but the comment stuck with him. Why was the dog acting this way? Finally, after what felt like forever, Emily came bounding out of the school gates, her ponytail bouncing behind her. She waved enthusiastically at John before noticing the commotion across the street. "Dad, why is that dog barking at you?" she asked as she climbed into the passenger seat. Her voice was light and curious, but John froze for a split second before shrugging casually. "Beats me," he said, trying to sound nonchalant. "Maybe he thinks I'm here to steal his treats." Emily giggled, oblivious to the unease creeping into her father's expression. As they drove away, John glanced back at the dog one last time. It was still barking now, its tail stiff and its ears perked forward. For reasons he couldn't explain, the image stayed with him long after they turned the corner. The car ride home was usually filled with laughter and chatter, but today, an odd silence lingered between John and Emily. The dog's barking had left a strange impression on both of them, though neither could quite put their finger on why. Emily kept glancing at her dad, her curious eyes searching for answers. "Do you think that dog knows you?" she asked suddenly, breaking the quiet hum of the engine. John chuckled nervously, gripping the steering wheel a little tighter. "Of course not," he replied, trying to sound confident. "Dogs don't recognize people like that. Maybe he just doesn't like my haircut." He gave her a playful wink, hoping to lighten the mood. Emily giggled, but the question still hung in the air, unanswered. She turned to look out the window, watching the trees blur past as they drove, while John focused intently on the road ahead. But deep down, his mind was racing. He couldn't stop thinking about the way the dog had stared at him, how its bark seemed sharp and deliberate, almost as if it were trying to send a message. What if it wasn't random? What if there really was something about him that set the dog off? John shook his head slightly, annoyed with himself for letting such thoughts take root. He reminded himself that dogs weren't psychic, They didn't have some magical ability to sense guilt or secrets. It was silly to even entertain the idea. Still, the memory of those piercing eyes stayed with him throughout the evening. At dinner, as Emily excitedly recounted her day to her mom, Sarah, John found himself distracted. He nodded along absent-mindedly, pretending to listen, but his thoughts kept drifting back to the dog. Even later, when he helped Emily with her homework at the kitchen table, his focus wavered. Every time he glanced up, he half expected to see the golden retriever mix glaring at him through the window. By bedtime, John decided it was time to let go of the whole thing. "It's just a dog," he muttered under his breath as he tucked Emily into bed. She looked up at him sleepily, clutching her favorite stuffed bear. "Will we see that dog again tomorrow?" she asked softly. "Probably not," John said, brushing a strand of hair from her forehead. "And even if we do, I'm sure he'll be too busy chasing squirrels to notice us." After saying good night, John headed downstairs to unwind. He flipped on the TV, scrolling aimlessly through channels without really paying attention. Then, as he reached for his phone to check social media, a notification popped up, a local news alert. The headline read, "Missing child case sparks concern in Maplewood." John froze, his thumb hovering over the screen. His heart began to race as he clicked on the article. According to the report, a young child had gone missing earlier that week near one of the parks close to the school. Authorities were looking for a man driving a silver vehicle who had been seen lingering around schools during pickup times. Details were scarce, but the description sent a chill down John's spine. A silver vehicle. Schools. It was too close for comfort. Suddenly, the dog's behavior made a lot more sense. And yet, it only raised more questions. Had the dog somehow sensed something dangerous about him? Or worse, was it warning Emily? John swallowed hard, feeling a knot tighten in his stomach. He tried to push the thought away, telling himself it was impossible. Dogs didn't know things like that, did they? As he sat there staring at the screen, the room grew eerily quiet. Outside, the wind rustled the leaves, and somewhere in the distance, another dog began to bark. That night, sleep eluded John completely. The more he tried to relax, the more his mind replayed the events of the day. The dog's relentless barking, Emily's innocent questions, and now the unsettling news article about the missing child. Each detail seemed to weave itself into a tangled web of unease. He tossed and turned in bed, staring at the ceiling as shadows danced across the walls from the streetlights outside. Sarah stirred beside him, sensing his restlessness. "You okay?" she murmured groggily, her voice soft in the darkness. "Yeah, just thinking," John replied quietly, careful not to wake her fully. He didn't want to share what was on his mind. Not yet. How could he explain something he barely understood himself? Instead, he told her it was work stress, a half-truth that felt easier than diving into the strange encounter with the dog or the chilling missing child case. When morning came, John rose early, unable to stay in bed any longer. As he made coffee in the quiet kitchen, his thoughts drifted back to his college days, a time he rarely let himself revisit. Back then, life had been chaotic and reckless. He'd made mistakes, bad ones, but he'd always believed he'd left those years behind when he married Sarah and started a family. Now memories of his past began creeping back like unwelcome ghosts. Was it possible someone from those days still held a grudge? Or worse, was there some unresolved piece of his history coming back to haunt him? Determined to shake off the paranoia, John decided to focus on the present. After dropping Emily off at school later that morning, he stopped by the local cafe for a cup of coffee. It was a place where everyone knew his name, a comforting constant in his otherwise ordinary life. But even here, surrounded by familiar faces, he couldn't escape the nagging feeling that something wasn't right. As he sipped his coffee, he noticed Mrs. Patterson walking her golden retriever mix down the sidewalk outside. His stomach tightened as the dog spotted him through the window. Just like before, it began barking wildly, straining against its leash as if desperate to reach him. Passers-by turned to look, their expressions curious and slightly amused. To them, it probably seemed like an overexcited pet having a moment. But to John, it felt personal, like the dog knew something no one else did. He quickly looked away, pretending to scroll through his phone. But the image stayed burned in his mind. Why was this happening? What did the dog see in him that others didn't? For a brief moment, he considered approaching Mrs. Patterson to ask if she'd noticed anything unusual about his behavior recently. But what would he say? "Hi, I think your dog might be psychic." It sounded ridiculous, even in his head. On the drive home, John found himself replaying every interaction he'd had near the school over the past few weeks. Had anyone been watching him? Was there someone who thought he fit the description of the man linked to the missing child case? The idea sent a shiver down his spine. He reminded himself that coincidences happened all the time, that just because he drove a silver SUV didn't mean he was involved in anything sinister. Still, doubt gnawed at him, planting seeds of fear he couldn't ignore. By the time he pulled into the driveway, his hands were gripping the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white. He took a deep breath, trying to steady himself. Whatever was going on, he needed answers, and soon. Because if the dog truly knew something, then maybe it wasn't just barking at him for no reason. Maybe it was trying to tell him something important, something dangerous. Over the next few days, John's unease grew into something much heavier, a constant weight pressing down on his chest. He tried to go about his life as usual, but everything felt different now. Even the simplest tasks, like making breakfast or driving Emily to school, were tinged with a sense of dread. Every time he passed another parent in the hallway or saw someone glance at his car, he wondered if they were thinking about the missing child case. Did they know something he didn't? Or worse, did they suspect him? The dog's barking haunted him too. It wasn't just that one day outside the school. Mrs. Patterson and her golden retriever seemed to pop up everywhere he went. At the grocery store parking lot, the park where Emily played soccer, even near the gas station, it was as if the dog had made it its mission to follow him. Each time, the reaction was the same. Frantic barking, pulling at the leash, and those piercing eyes locked onto him like a laser. Other people started noticing too. Some laughed it off, calling it funny or strange. Others gave him sideways glances, their expressions unreadable but laced with suspicion. One evening, while helping Emily with her math homework, she asked innocently, "Dad, do you think that dog is mad at you?" Her tone was light, almost teasing, but the question hit John like a punch to the gut. He forced a smile and joked, "Maybe I stepped on his paw once and forgot to apologize." But inside, he felt anything but amused. What if the dog was mad at him? What if it somehow knew things no human could? That night, unable to sleep, John sat alone in the living room flipping through old photo albums. He told himself it was nostalgia, a way to distract himself from the chaos swirling in his mind. But deep down, he was searching for answers, for proof that he was a good person, despite the mistakes of his past. The pictures showed happier times. John and Sarah on their wedding day, Emily blowing out candles on her birthday cakes, family vacations to the beach. They reminded him of how far he'd come since his reckless college days, when bad decisions and questionable friendships had defined him. But as he flipped through the pages, one particular photo caught his eye. A group picture from his college graduation. Standing off to the side was a face he hadn't seen in years. Mark Reynolds, an old friend who'd always been trouble. Back then, John had idolized Mark, following him into schemes that ranged from harmless pranks to borderline illegal activities. Eventually, John had cut ties with him, choosing a better path for himself. But now, staring at Mark's smug grin in the faded photograph, he couldn't help but wonder, what if Mark hadn't changed? What if he was still out there causing problems and dragging John's name into them? The thought sent a chill through him. Could this be why the dog kept barking? Was it warning him not just about himself, but about someone else from his past? The more he thought about it, the more it made sense. Maybe the dog wasn't accusing him directly. It was trying to protect him. Protect Emily. By morning, John's resolve hardened. He needed to confront whatever was lurking in the shadows of his past before it consumed him, or worse, put his family in danger. As he drove Emily to school, he promised himself he'd dig deeper into the missing child case, even if it meant facing uncomfortable truths. Because one thing was clear: until he figured out what the dog knew, he'd never feel safe again. And neither would Emily. It was a crisp Thursday evening when John's fragile sense of normalcy shattered completely. He had just finished making dinner, spaghetti with garlic bread, one of Emily's favorites, and was setting the table when there was a sharp knock at the door. The sound startled him, and for a moment, he froze, his hand hovering over a plate. His heart began to race as he glanced toward the living room, where Sarah and Emily were watching TV together. Who could be visiting at this hour? Reluctantly, John walked to the door and opened it to find two police officers standing on his porch. They introduced themselves as Detectives Miller and Carter, their badges glinting under the porch light. Both wore serious expressions, their eyes scanning him carefully. "Mr. Harper?" Detective Miller asked, his voice calm but firm. "We'd like to ask you a few questions about an ongoing investigation." John's stomach dropped. He forced a smile, though his hands trembled slightly as he wiped them on his jeans. "Of course," he said, stepping aside to let them in. "What's this about?" The detectives exchanged a quick glance before entering. They declined his offer of coffee or tea, opting instead to get straight to the point. "We're investigating reports of suspicious activity near Maplewood Elementary School," Detective Carter explained, pulling out a small notepad. "Specifically, we've received information regarding a silver vehicle seen multiple times in the area around the time a child went missing earlier this week." John's throat went dry. He swallowed hard, trying to keep his composure. "That's concerning," he managed to say, his voice cracking slightly. "But I'm not sure how I can help. I pick up my daughter from school every day. It's part of my routine." Detective Miller nodded slowly, studying him closely. "We understand that, Mr. Harper, but witnesses have mentioned seeing your vehicle in the vicinity more than usual recently. Could you confirm your whereabouts last Tuesday afternoon?" For a split second, John hesitated. Last Tuesday, he remembered it clearly. It was the day he'd gone to the park after work to clear his head. The same day the news reported the child had disappeared. He hadn't told anyone about his visit to the park, not even Sarah. Now, standing face to face with the detectives, he realized how suspicious it might sound if he admitted being there. "I was at home," he said finally, his voice steady but quieter than he intended, "with my family." There was a long pause. Detective Carter raised an eyebrow, jotting something down in his notebook. "Are you certain about that, Mr. Harper? Because several parents recall seeing your car parked near the soccer field that afternoon." John felt the walls closing in around him. His palms grew sweaty, and his mind raced. Why hadn't he thought to mention the park earlier? Would they believe him if he explained now? Before he could respond, Detective Miller spoke again, his tone softer but no less probing. "We'd also like permission to search your vehicle, Mr. Harper, just as a precaution." Panic surged through John's veins. A search. What if they found something? Anything that linked him to the case, even if it wasn't his fault. How would he explain it? For a moment, he considered refusing, but he knew that would only make him look guilty. Instead, he nodded stiffly, forcing himself to appear cooperative. "Sure," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Go ahead." As the detectives headed toward the driveway, John followed behind, his legs feeling like lead. Every step felt heavier than the last, each breath shallow and labored. He watched as they opened the doors of his SUV, shining flashlights inside. His heart pounded in his ears, drowning out the sound of their movements. And then, just as he thought things couldn't get worse, Detective Carter crouched low and pulled something from beneath the passenger seat, A torn piece of fabric, faded but unmistakably familiar. It matched the description of the clothing worn by the missing child. "This shouldn't be here," John stammered, his voice trembling. "I swear, I don't know how it got there." Detective Miller gave him a long, hard look before speaking. "We'll need to take this into evidence, Mr. Harper, and we'll have to ask you to come down to the station for further questioning." As the gravity of the situation sank in, John realized one thing. Whether he liked it or not, his life was about to change forever. The ride to the police station felt like an eternity. John sat in the back seat of the unmarked car, his hands clenched tightly together as Detective Miller drove and Detective Carter occasionally glanced back at him. The air inside was heavy with unspoken questions, each second stretching longer than the last. John's mind raced, replaying every detail of the past week. The dogs barking, the torn fabric, the detective's prodding stares. He tried to piece it all together, but nothing made sense. How could something so incriminating end up in his car without his knowledge? When they arrived at the station, John was led into a small, sterile interrogation room. The walls were pale gray, and the fluorescent lights buzzed faintly overhead. A single table stood in the center, surrounded by 3 chairs. It was the kind of place he'd only seen on TV, and now here he was, sitting nervously, while 2 detectives questioned him about a missing child. The irony wasn't lost on him. Detective Miller started gently, asking John to recount his movements on the day the child disappeared. John did his best to explain, sticking to the truth as much as possible. He described how he'd gone to the park after work to clear his head, how he'd noticed a group of kids playing near the playground, and how he'd left shortly after realizing it wasn't helping him relax. "I swear," he insisted, his voice cracking under the weight of his emotions, "I didn't see anything unusual. I wasn't involved." But Detective Carter wasn't satisfied. "Then can you explain this?" he asked, holding up the torn piece of fabric sealed in a plastic evidence bag. The sight of it sent a fresh wave of panic through John. He shook his head frantically. "I don't know how it got there," he exclaimed. "Someone must have planted it." The detectives exchanged another one of those loaded glances, their skepticism evident. They pressed him further, asking about his past, his college days, his old friends, any connections he might have had to people who could be considered dangerous. At first, John hesitated, reluctant to dredge up memories he'd worked so hard to bury. But as the questioning intensified, he realized he had no choice. He told them about Mark Reynolds, the reckless friend from his youth, and admitted that their relationship had soured years ago when John decided to turn his life around. "We haven't spoken in over a decade," John said firmly, leaning forward in his chair. "But if anyone wanted to frame me for something, it would probably be him." The detectives nodded thoughtfully, jotting down notes. Still, they weren't ready to let him go. They asked permission to search his house next, hoping to find more clues. John agreed, though fear gnawed at him. What if they found something else, something he couldn't explain? Back at home, Sarah greeted the officers with wide eyes and trembling hands. Emily clung to her mother, confused and scared. John watched helplessly as the detectives combed through every room, opening drawers, checking closets, and inspecting corners. When they reached the garage, they discovered something unexpected. A set of muddy boots tucked away in a corner, partially hidden behind some gardening tools. The mud matched soil samples taken from the area near where the child had vanished. John's heart sank. "Those are old," he protested. "I haven't worn them in weeks." Detective Miller raised an eyebrow. "Mind if we take these too?" Defeated, John nodded. As the boots were bagged and labeled, he felt the walls closing in even tighter. This was spiraling out of control, and he had no idea how to stop it. Later that night, as John lay awake in bed, staring at the ceiling, he replayed everything in his mind. The dogs barking, the fabric, the boots. It all seemed designed to point the finger at him. But why? Who would want to frame him? And what connection did it have to the missing child? One thing was certain. John wasn't just fighting to prove his innocence anymore. He was fighting to protect his family and uncover the truth before it was too late. The days that followed were a blur of tension and uncertainty for John. The detectives continued their investigation, piecing together clues while John's life unraveled bit by bit. News of the torn fabric and muddy boots spread quickly through Maplewood, fueled by whispers at school gates, grocery stores, and coffee shops. Neighbors who had once greeted him warmly now avoided eye contact or crossed the street to steer clear of him. Even Sarah, his wife, struggled to hide her doubts, though she tried to stay supportive for Emily's sake. At the station, John endured hours of grueling interviews. Detectives Miller and Carter pushed him to recall every detail about his visit to the park, the exact time he arrived, how long he stayed, whether he'd seen anyone suspicious. "Think harder, Mr. Harper," Detective Carter urged, leaning across the table. "Even the smallest thing could help us find this child." John racked his brain, desperate to remember something, anything, that might exonerate him. Then it hit him, a shadowy figure lurking near the playground. He described a man in dark clothing, crouched behind a tree, watching the children intently. "I thought it was odd," John admitted, his voice trembling with urgency. "But I didn't think much of it at the time. I figured maybe he was just a parent waiting for his kid." Detective Miller's eyes narrowed. "Did you get a good look at him?" "No," John replied honestly. "It was getting dark, and he kept to the shadows. But I'm sure it wasn't me. I swear on my daughter's life." The detectives exchanged another glance, this one tinged with curiosity rather than suspicion. They decided to follow up on John's lead, expanding their search to include surveillance footage from nearby businesses and homes. Meanwhile, John was released under strict instructions not to leave town, a condition that felt both relieving and suffocating. Back home, the atmosphere was tense. Emily peppered her father with questions he couldn't answer. "Why did those police officers come here? Are you in trouble?" Her innocent voice broke John's heart, but all he could do was hug her tightly and promise everything would be okay. Deep down, however, he wasn't so sure. As the investigation progressed, investigators uncovered new evidence linking someone else to the crime. A man named Carl Hargrove, a drifter with a history of petty theft and trespassing. Security cameras captured him wandering near the park around the same time the child disappeared, carrying a backpack that matched the description given by witnesses. More importantly, traces of soil found on his shoes matched samples from the abduction site. When confronted, Carl initially denied involvement but eventually cracked under pressure. He confessed to snatching the child, claiming he'd acted impulsively after spotting them alone near the playground. According to Carl, he'd panicked when he realized people were searching for him and abandoned the child in a remote area outside town. The news brought relief to John, but also anger. Someone had deliberately planted the fabric and boots in his car and garage, framing him to throw investigators off Carl's trail. Who it was remained unclear, though John suspected Mark Reynolds, his old college friend turned enemy, might have played a role. Though cleared of direct involvement, John knew his reputation would take time to heal. Some neighbors still eyed him warily, unable to fully trust him despite the evidence proving his innocence. But John refused to let bitterness consume him. Instead, he focused on rebuilding trust, not just with his community, but with himself. One evening, as he sat on the porch watching Emily play with her friends, John felt a flicker of hope. Life wouldn't return to normal overnight, but he vowed to make amends where he could. If nothing else, this ordeal had taught him the importance of facing the past head-on and fighting for what truly mattered. In the weeks that followed, John worked tirelessly to rebuild his life and restore his family's sense of safety. The investigation into Carl Hargrove had shifted the spotlight away from him, but the scars of suspicion lingered. Some neighbors still whispered behind his back, and invitations to neighborhood gatherings dwindled. Yet John refused to let bitterness take root. Instead, he channeled his energy into something meaningful, helping families affected by similar tragedies. he began volunteering with a local organization dedicated to finding missing children. At first, it was daunting, walking into meetings where people eyed him cautiously, unsure if they could trust him. But over time, his dedication won them over. He helped distribute flyers, organized search parties, and even spoke at community events about the importance of vigilance and unity. It wasn't just about redemption. It was about making sure no other child, or parent, had to endure what he and Emily had gone through. Sarah noticed the change in him too. "You seem lighter," she said one evening as they sat together on the couch. John smiled faintly, nodding. "I think I needed this," he admitted, "to remind myself that I can still do good, even after everything." Emily, ever resilient, bounced back faster than anyone expected. She returned to school with her usual enthusiasm, though she occasionally asked about the dog that had barked so furiously at her dad. One Saturday morning, while walking her to soccer practice, John spotted Mrs. Patterson and her golden retriever mix across the street. The dog wagged its tail lazily, showing no sign of recognition or hostility. For the first time in weeks, John felt a pang of gratitude toward the animal. Whether it had truly sensed danger or simply reacted to something unknown, it had forced him to confront truths he buried long ago. Mrs. Patterson waved warmly when she saw them. "How are you holding up, John?" she asked, her tone kind and free of judgment. "I'm doing better," he replied honestly. "Thanks for asking." As they parted ways, John couldn't help but marvel at how far he'd come since that fateful afternoon outside the school. The experience had been harrowing, but it had also taught him invaluable lessons about accountability, resilience, and the power of second chances. One day, while driving through town, John passed a mural painted on the side of a building, a vibrant tribute to the missing child who had been found safe thanks to the efforts of countless volunteers. Seeing it filled him with pride, knowing he played a small part in bringing closure to a frightened family. He made a mental note to bring Emily here someday, to show her how communities could come together in times of need. Though whispers of doubt still lingered in Maplewood, John chose not to dwell on them. Instead, he focused on nurturing the bonds that mattered most, with Sarah, with Emily, and with himself. Every morning, as he sipped his coffee and watched the sunrise, he reminded himself that life wasn't defined by mistakes. It was shaped by how you rose above them. And as for the dog, well, John often joked that it deserved a medal for its uncanny instincts. But privately, he wondered if its barking had saved Emily from harm that day, not because of anything sinister he'd done, but because it had pushed him to face his past and become the man his family needed him to be. Sometimes, he thought, heroes came in unexpected forms, even scruffy golden retrievers with sharp barks and sharper eyes.